Gordon's gin used to be the gold standard of British gin, 40% proof, a staple of every Christmas, every wedding, and every summer barbecue. It was the safe bottle, the one you bought because you knew exactly what you were getting, a punchy, juniper-forward spirit that defined the great British G&T. But look at the bottle in your cupboard right now. It's weaker. In 1992, Gordon's quietly watered down your drink to 37.5%. It was a tax-saving move that handed them an extra £6 million a year in pure profit, but it left Brits with a hollowed-out spirit. They thought you wouldn't notice the betrayal. They thought the brand was too big to fail. They were wrong. In 2023, Gordon's suffered the most catastrophic sales crash of any alcohol brand in UK history, losing a staggering £72.8 million in a single year. How did the world's biggest gin brand become a victim of its own corporate greed? Why are Americans still drinking the strong stuff, while us Brits are left with the scraps? And is that green bottle sitting in your kitchen right now a symbol of heritage? Or a symbol of how much a company can get away with before the public finally says, enough? This is the rise, the watering down, and the ultimate fall of a British icon. The gin that built an empire. Let me take you back to 1769. London was recovering from the worst gin crisis in British history. Hogarth's Gin Lane had shown the world what cheap, poisonous gin could do to a city. Into this chaos stepped Alexander Gordon. Not English, mind you, Scottish. He had a radical idea. What if gin could actually be good? Gordon set up his distillery in Southwark, found clean water, used proper botanicals, and created something that wouldn't kill you after 3 glasses. Britain was about to become an empire. The Royal Navy would sail to every corner of the world, and they needed something stronger than beer, but safer than the rock-gut gin that was flooding London's gutters. Gordon's gin became the empire's drink. Wherever British ships docked, that green bottle followed. India, Australia, Hong Kong. Gordon's was there first. Gordon's wasn't originally called London Dry Gin. That label didn't appear until the early 1900s. Your quintessentially English gin was built by a Scotsman and marketed as London's finest decades after the fact. The marketing worked. By 1962, Gordon's was the world's highest-selling gin. Not just in Britain, everywhere. Think about that for a second. In the 1960s, when British influence was at its peak, Gordon's gin was outselling every other gin on the planet. By the 1980s, Gordon's accounted for 70% of all gin sold in British pubs. 7 out of every 10 gin and tonics came from that green bottle. The numbers were staggering. Gordon's was selling 88 million bottles worldwide every year. In Britain alone, they shifted 10 million cases annually. "It's got to be Gordon's" wasn't just an advertising slogan, it was a statement of fact. For most British drinkers, there simply wasn't another choice worth considering. But success breeds complacency, and by the 1980s, something was stirring. The very generation that grew up watching their parents drink Gordon's was about to reject everything it stood for. The children of the Gordon's generation were coming of age, and they wanted nothing to do with their parents' gin. The vodka invasion. Picture this, you're 22 years old in 1985. Your parents drink Gordon's and tonic whilst watching the snooker. What's the last thing you want to order at the pub? Exactly. Gin became the drink of your parents. Boring, old-fashioned, about as exciting as watching paint dry on a Sunday afternoon. The youth were moving to vodka. It was seen as cool, and brands like Smirnoff and Absolut were marketed as clean, modern, and international. They didn't taste like juniper. They tasted like whatever you mixed them with. To a 22-year-old in a neon-lit nightclub in 1985, gin was something your gran drank before her Sunday roast. In 1980, 10.3% of UK adults drank gin regularly. In 1995, that number had collapsed to just 8.6%. Volume consumption crashed from 144,000 hectolitres to 100,000 hectolitres. That's nearly a third of the total gin volume vanished in just 15 years. Gin was stuck in the 1950s, associated with colonial administrators, conservative politicians, and people who said what unironically. Gordon's was bleeding and they tried to fight back. The Green campaign in the late 1980s was clever. Witty cinema adverts that made jokes about the bottle itself. Martians relaxing in peas. Get it? Green like the bottle? But here's the problem. Cinema and print advertising only reached people who were already going to pubs and buying magazines. The young drinkers Gordon's desperately needed were watching MTV and drinking in nightclubs. Gordon's was fighting the wrong battle in the wrong places. They were fighting the wrong battle. They were trying to convince people that the green bottle was fun. But the real problem was that people were losing interest in the liquid inside. In 1995, Gordon's did something that shocked the entire drinks industry. They broke the voluntary television advertising ban on spirits. That first advert, Invigoration, showed a man diving through a straw into a glass of Gordon's and tonic. This wasn't just marketing. This was desperation. Gordon's was so worried about losing relevance that they unilaterally ended a ban that had existed for decades. The industry went mad. Competitors accused Gordon's of breaking ranks. Health groups predicted chaos. Gordon's was dying and they knew it. Market share was bleeding away to vodka, to wine, to anything that didn't scream, "Your dad's drink." The Invigoration campaign was Gordon's last desperate attempt to prove they weren't dead. But whilst everyone was watching the adverts, Gordon's was making a decision that would haunt them for the next 3 decades. And it all started with a quiet announcement in 1992 that most people missed entirely. The 1992 Betrayal. 1992 is the year everything changed. The year Gordon's committed what can only be described as the Great Gin Betrayal. They reduced the alcohol content from 40% to 37.5%. And they thought you wouldn't notice. Here's what really happened. European regulations allowed spirits to be bottled at the minimum legal strength of 37.5%. Gordon's realised they could save approximately £6 million a year in excise duty. £6 million every year, just by making their gin weaker. The official line was beautiful in its cynicism. They claimed they wanted to bring Gordon's in line with other white spirits like vodka and white rum. Complete rubbish, of course. Bombay Sapphire stayed at 40%, as did Beefeater stayed at 40%, because they knew that the alcohol is what carries the flavour of the botanicals. Only Gordon's took the cheap option. The backlash was immediate and furious. Ken Robertson, United Distillers Corporate Relations Director, later said, "You need to remember that Gordon's was not just Britain's most popular gin. It was an emotional fixture of national identity, as evocative as the London bus and red telephone boxes. They'd messed with something sacred, and people noticed. And here's the kicker. Americans still get 40% Gordon's. The European export version is 47.3%. Only we Brits got the watered-down special. Gordon's was willing to serve an inferior diluted product to their most loyal home market, the British people who had made them the world leader and supported them for over 200 years, while keeping the good stuff for the rest of the world. They bet that you wouldn't notice, and for a while, because they owned the supermarket shelves, they were right. The difference is real. At 37.5%, the botanicals struggle to shine through. The gin tastes thin, watery, like a ghost of its former self. At 40% or 47.3%, you get the full Gordon's experience. The juniper punches through. The coriander adds complexity. It actually tastes like gin. This wasn't just about alcohol strength. This was about trust. About treating your most loyal customers like mugs who wouldn't notice corporate penny pinching. You'd think this betrayal would finish Gordon's. The brand that had survived 200 plus years surely couldn't survive lying to an entire nation about what was in the bottle, right? The craft gin revolution. For a decade, Gordon's survived on sheer size. But in the mid-2000s, something shifted. People started to care about what they were drinking again. The craft revolution began. Hendrick's launched in 1999, served with cucumber instead of lemon. Premium price, premium positioning. Bombay Sapphire repositioned itself as premium. Tanqueray got trendy. New brands popped up every month. Crucially, they were 40% ABV or higher. And it worked. Suddenly, British drinkers realised what they'd been missing. They tasted these new gins and realised that a G&T should have a bite. It should have a complex aroma. They looked at the Gordon's bottle in their cupboard and saw 37.5% for what it really was, a cost-cutting measure. The gin renaissance had arrived, but Gordon's seemed to be missing from the party. They were seen as cheap. Then came Gordon's £15 million response. In 2002, they launched the biggest relaunch in the brand's history to survive. New bottle, new advertising, new positioning. The tagline, "Mix Gordon's with pleasure," replaced decades of "It's got to be Gordon's." The adverts were slick. A young couple playing strip chess with ice pieces. Sophisticated, modern, nothing like the stuffy gin of old. They tried to act like a premium brand while still selling a budget-strength spirit. The 2000s saw the gin essence. Sales of gin in the UK doubled in 5 years. But Gordon's wasn't leading the way with quality. But then came their masterstroke. Gordon's Pink, launched quietly in 2017, positioned cleverly. Not a craft gin trying to be premium, just Gordon's with a bit of berry flavouring and a pretty colour. Gordon's started leading the way with flavours. The numbers were extraordinary. By 2023, Gordon's Pink and regular Gordon's became the UK's top 2 on-trade gin brands by sales value. £251 million and £236 million respectively. While everyone was talking about craft gin, Gordon's quietly dominated the tills. The craft gin boom that was supposed to kill Gordon's actually saved it. Premium gins made gin fashionable again. Young people started drinking gin and tonics. The category expanded massively. And Gordon's was perfectly positioned to capture the volume. Not the Instagram posts or the food magazine features, the actual drinking. When someone wanted a gin and tonic that didn't cost £12, they reached for Gordon's. Still there, still reliable, still the gin their parents and grandparents had drunk. By the 2010s, Gordon's was selling 7 million cases annually worldwide. Still the biggest international gin brand on the planet. The watering down hadn't killed them. The uncool period hadn't killed them. If anything, being the boring option had become their superpower. For a moment, it looked like the 1992 betrayal had been forgotten. Gordon's was back on top, but they had built their new empire on a fad, and in 2020, everything changed again. The 2023 reckoning. 2020 arrived with a pandemic. 2023 brought a cost of living crisis. Suddenly, even Gordon's wasn't cheap enough. The gin boom was officially over. Trade magazines declared it dead. Premium brands crashed. Even Gordon's couldn't escape. According to the Grocer's annual report, Gordon's suffered a decline so large it sent shockwaves through the industry. They lost £72.8 million in a single year. That's a drop of 20.5% in sales volume. The biggest decline of any alcohol brand in the British off-trade. Market share was bleeding to supermarket-owned labels and health-conscious abstainers. Gordon's had watered down their liquid 30 years ago. They had no premium defence left. They weren't better than the supermarket version. They were the same. The only difference was the yellow label. Gordon's wasn't alone. Whitley Neal, Bombay Sapphire, Tanqueray, they all suffered massive losses. Between them, they shed £33.9 million in value. The entire premium gin category was crashing in general, but the drinkers who did have money were moving to true gins, brands that hadn't betrayed their strength. Gordon's was caught in a pincer movement. Gordon's lost more money in 2023 than their next 3 competitors combined. It wasn't just a bad year, it was a rejection of the brand's identity. Gordon's tried to adapt. Alcohol-free versions, new flavours, desperately chasing trends that had already moved on. So what does this mean? Is this the end of Gordon's? Or just another chapter in a 250-year story of survival? That green bottle sitting in your cupboard right now has survived the gin craze of the 1700s, 2 world wars, the vodka invasion, the craft gin boom, and now the post-boom crash. It's weaker than it used to be. It's owned by a massive corporation that cares more about tax savings than tradition. It's made in Scotland, not London, but it's still there. So where does that leave the world's most famous gin? Gordon's is a brand that survived for over 250 years. It survived the Gin Acts, the World Wars, and the decline of the British Empire. But it might not survive its own accounting department. The 1992 watering down was a gamble. For 30 years, it looked like they'd won. They pocketed hundreds of millions of pounds in tax savings while serving a weaker product to the British public. But you can only trade on a name for so long before people realise the liquid inside has changed. Gordon's isn't just a gin, it's a lesson. It's a lesson that you can't water down your heritage and expect your customers to stay loyal forever. The British public might be slow to move, but once they realise they're being treated like mugs, they don't come back. The green bottle is still there, it's still in your local. But it's no longer the gold standard. It's a reminder of a time when British made meant 40% proof, and when a brand's word was as strong as its spirit. If you remember the old 40% Gordon's, or if you've switched to a different brand because you're fed up with watered-down Britain, let me know in the comments. I want to hear your stories of the brands that used to be better. And if you want to see more deep dives into the rise and fall of British icons, hit that subscribe button. Next week, we're looking at another British staple,